And welcome, everyone. Good evening. I'm just going to share my screen right now, and you should see a title slide going into full screen momentarily. Management considerations for soil amendments. So this is part two of the series on soil amendments. Apologies for last week. We had a bit of a technical issue with the Zoom account, but happy that we were able to reschedule for today. So as just a reminder, we have a four series, at least I'll be part of a four series. There'll be a number of other colleagues that will be presenting in between. Today, we'll be covering management considerations around soil amendments. I had an introduction to soil amendments recorded on June 25th. Next week, I believe my colleague, Dr. David Burton, will be focusing dominantly on fertility and nitrogen. But after that, I'll be coming back to amendments with respect to conversion processes and maybe highlight a few novel soil amendments. And then I will close off at least the series that I'll be involved with related to understanding biosolids as soil amendments. So I'm going to just recap a little bit from the introduction to soil amendments and highlight the nature of the systems that we're dealing with. And agriculture in particular doesn't exist in a vacuum. In fact, the interface between agricultural systems, whether it be livestock or agricultural, are getting blurred now with urban development and industry. But you can see here the range of flows that may be connected to or from agriculture out into the urban industrial environment and flows back into agriculture. And so soil amendments aren't necessarily to be considered materials that are just originating from agriculture, although certainly a large proportion, certainly particularly in livestock, are related to agricultural production systems. So soil amendments, again, just to recap what our terms are, generally soil amendments are materials that are added to improve soil properties, and those might be for nutrient supply and crop fertility, increased organic matter in the soils, soil health, improving soil structure and porosity, and often we're focusing on improving soil biology, that's microbiology and mesofauna. Some of the terminology that you may see as you peruse the literature or as you do searches for soil amendments, you may see soil amendments as soil conditioners, and these are materials that are added to soil in order to improve physical properties such as soil structure and drainage and infiltration. You may often see the term organic amendments, and so these are not specific to organic certification, but just the nature of the material themselves being organic or based on carbon. And these materials are added to improve fertility, soil physical, biological properties, and originate from once living materials. Biofertilizers are another term that you may see in the literature and your searches, and these are materials that are added to soil in order to introduce new or greater quantities of or specific types of microorganisms that are thought to improve activity. So that's chemical cycling, nutrient cycling, or perhaps resistance in plants and resilience in terms of plant production. And then fertilizers, at least in Canada, are defined and regulated by the CFIA as in the Fertilizer Act as a substance or a mixture of substances that contain nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, or other plant food manufactured, sold, or represented as a plant nutrient. And typically these are a function of labeling requirements under the CFIA. So some of the considerations that I'm going to try to go over today with respect to soil amendments are purpose or need. So purpose and need for soil amendments may involve disposing or recycling of on-farm biomass or off-farm materials that are being brought in for specific uses on the farm. In addition, there are specific characteristics around soil amendments and considerations around the use of soil amendments that need to come into play when you're looking at management. And in order to do that, we need to understand a little bit of how soil amendments work. And in particular, we need to understand how soil amendments work in the soil. And I'm going to cover off a very generic, a very general, I'm going to call it a calculation commentary on economics and potential returns associated with the purposeful use of soil amendments. So I'm going to start talking a little bit around purpose. And so in soil amendments in the introduction that I gave in the first webinar really covered off the range of different types of amendments that are out there and the sources of those amendments. You can see that they vary in form, they vary in source, they vary in how they look, and they vary in how they might need to be managed. Their particle size, the liquid versus solid form, whether it's a homogeneous or a more heterogeneous material. And so these are all part of the considerations that will come into play when you start to manage, or if you already have been managing organic amendments or conditioners, soil conditioners, you already have some sense of what we're talking about. So with respect to, say, managing livestock materials, often manures can come in liquid or dry, and the quantities will vary. And as you think about liquid manure systems, the quantity of liquid that you have to deal with and how you deal with that material is going to be encompassed partly by storage capacity, and there's a seasonality around how that material can be added, as opposed to dry material, which may have slightly different management considerations. Dry materials can be composted, for instance. At least they can be composted more easily than liquid. And these management approaches for livestock manures are going to be contained or constrained by the availability of land, proximity of the material to that land base where you can manage the manures or amendments that are being generated, and the type of crop management system that you are involved with. Similarly for bedding and manure, so these are the mixtures, storage capacity, and barn style will play a role in how that material is managed. And again, composting might play a role, which may require separate footprint, separate facilities. Feed and wastewaters have different and or similar, approaches to managing for management. So feed as a solid material can be incorporated with manures, incorporated with bedding and manures, and composted. Wastewaters may require some type of artificial wetland, or may require some type of land application, depending on the nature of the wastewater and the ability for storage and collection. Just as an example of what we're talking about in the context of animal manures, the table below illustrates the calculations, or at least some components of the calculations that might be required to think about when you are collecting manures, or you're thinking of setting up an operation around livestock. So the table identifies the kilograms per day per head that's being generated of specific manure production, the dry matter content. And so you can see cattle generate somewhere around 29 kilos per day per head, pigs somewhere around 2.5, chickens 0.084 kilograms per day per head. And so as you start to multiply out the number of individuals that you have on your farm, you can start to generate initial calculations associated with not only the quantity of manure, but the characteristics of that manure with respect to the dry matter, so the amount of solids, and some of the nutrient components that are associated with that. Just for illustration's sake, I found some graphics that identify global manure production rates relative to human manure production rates around different species. We can see that the organic matter in the dark on the left-hand side, in the dark color on the column, versus the dry matter in the light color in the column. Cattle across dairy and beef far outnumber the amount of millions of tons per day that are generated, versus poultry somewhere around 0.85 to 1.22 million tons per day. And if we start to convert those global values into nutrient recovery, we can see the potential values for N, P, and K in millions of kilos per day. So this is to illustrate the scope of the potential generation of manure as a soil amendment, and its benefits or potential benefits, but again, also its potential environmental impact. as it's represented in terms of its nutrient content. So some of the advantages for using soil amendments, particularly in livestock systems, is disposal of materials that are generated on farm. And this enables us as the land managers, the environmental managers, the scientists to help promote natural cycling of organic matter and these nutrients to hopefully increase soil health properties and soil quality in the long term. And in some cases, potentially looking at ways to mitigate climate change and to enable carbon sequestration through the use of these materials rather than sending them off to places where they might not benefit as much. So here we have an individual who is trying to take benefit and maybe doesn't have enough of the materials to apply to the land base that they have. So, general considerations that you'll want to take on with respect to management of different soil amendments, and same for any kind of material that's being added to soil, fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, that you want to have the right source, the right rate, the right timing, and the right place for these materials. Whether these be crop residues, crop rotations, or cover crops that may protect the soil surface and that add organic matter and add nutrients in the long term, or whether they be manure applications that can be used to enhance not only soil biology, but also soil fertility. And so understanding the nature of these materials and therefore being able to determine and make the right decisions around the rate and the timing and the place certainly will come into play a little bit later in this presentation. There are other ways to amend soil. Rotational grazing can not only help reduce soil erosion, but it can add organic matter in a distributed way as the animals move around the pasture. One of the dominant considerations with respect to applying any kind of amendment or any kind of material onto an intensive or a somewhat intensive agricultural system is trying to manage the amount of traffic to reduce the amount of compaction on that. So these are some of the decision factors that are going to come into play when you are considering the use of your amendments, the timing, the amount. The flip side of all of this with respect to the use of soil amendments is that there are benefits outside of just general crop production and fertility for the plants. We have the soil health outcomes in plant systems that are receiving amendments. This table here, or this graphic here, illustrates the different soil physical, chemical, and biological properties that are indicators of soil health that are responding to the use of amendments. And so if they are on the right-hand side, if the bubbles are on the right-hand side of the dashed vertical line, then it means that there is some improvement in some of the properties of soil that are represented within the soil health matrix. So things such as soil bulk density, soil moisture, aggregate stability, microbial down here, microbial biomass, carbon, microbial biomass, nitrogen. Again, if we're looking at it in the context specifically related to reduced tillage systems or cover crop systems or amendments, you can see that the round bubbles that are representative of amendments, the round bubbles really do play a significant role in providing benefits to soil health properties such as aggregate stability in the soil, microbial biomass, carbon, which again is a way to sequester and to cycle carbon in a more natural cyclical way. Respiration, the quantity of carbon that is in the soil, as well as a number of other factors such as vegetable crop yield. So when we're managing soil amendments and we're thinking about the general characteristics of these materials for management, there are a range of considerations that come into play. For instance, we're really managing different chemistries. We're managing the chemistries of the biology as well as the chemistries that are inherent in the material themselves. So we're managing things, certainly from a crop production perspective, things associated with nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium as our macronutrients, but also the whole range of micronutrients as well. Boron, calcium, magnesium, aluminum, and potentially heavy metals, where we need to have some care around the potential mobility of heavy metals into water or the accumulation of heavy metals in soil. And then the table on the right hand side of your screen, the 7.6, just illustrates again the reason why those micronutrients are important. Iron being important for photosynthesis and chlorophyll production, manganese being important in the electron transport and photosynthesis and detoxification of oxygen-free radicals. Zinc being involved in carbohydrate metabolism, protein synthesis, and detoxification, and molybdate being involved in enzymes that catalyze biological nitrogen fixation and responsible for pollen formation in plants. So these are the chemistries that we're managing, not only when we add fertilizers, but when we're adding soil amendments as well. And so understanding the whole scope of the materials beyond just the N, P, and K becomes critically important in sort of the long-term sustainable soil management and crop management. The type of material that you may be adding may be promoting acidity in your soil, or maybe promoting alkalinity. And so, understanding that chemistry and the role that that chemistry has in terms of the rate of application, the source of the material, is also another important consideration, particularly in Atlantic Canada, where most of the time we're dealing with acidic soils, and so adding an acid material may promote certain inhibition of nutrient cycling, versus if you're adding an alkaline material that may be promoting and being an alternative to your lime source, but promoting an increase in your nutrient cycling, at least in the cycling of certain nutrients that are critically important for crop production. So I'll focus a little bit on four elements that are dominantly of importance in our soil management, environmental management, and so in particular, carbon's becoming an important piece of our understanding related to climate change, but it's certainly the quality and the quantity of carbon that's contained within different types of amendments is an important consideration, particularly because carbon drives decomposition. And so when we're talking about management of chemistries, we're not just managing the chemistry inherent in the amendments, but we're managing the interaction of the chemistry in the amendments with respect to the chemistry in the microbiology in the soils. And so carbon is a big driver of that decomposition, and it controls, in most instances, the rate of release of the chemistry or of nutrients. Nitrogen, as well, has been determined to be very closely linked to carbon with respect to being a driver of decomposition. And so the carbon and nitrogen ratio in amendments will play a key role in and helps us to understand somewhat the decomposition of amendments. And this 25-to-1, this ratio of 25 units of carbon to each single unit of nitrogen, has been a key parameter that's allowed us to understand the kind of optimum ratio for an amendment when we're adding it to soil. For instance, a low C to N ratio, and that could be a C to N ratio that's somewhere below 15-to-1, will result in what's identified as a rapid release of nutrients, or what we call mineralization. High C to N ratio, which is typically greater than 60-to-1. It could be greater than 30, 35. It really depends on, again, the characteristics, the physical characteristics and the chemical characteristics of the soil amendments that I discussed generally in the first webinar. But a high C to N ratio may result in a very slow release of nutrients, which we term immobilization. So immobilization means that it's being held, mineralization meaning that there is a release. And similarly, this occurs with most of our nutrients, but we have a carbon phosphorus ratio that less than 200-to-1 results in mineralization of phosphorus, and greater than 300-to-1 results in immobilization. But these ratios with carbon alone aren't the only environmental drivers or biological drivers. You can see in the figure on the right-hand side, this is the amount of phosphorus that's fixed in the soil. And we can see that the range or highest availability for phosphorus is often typically determined as much by pH in the soil. And as we get closer to a more neutral pH, we have a fairly substantial potential for phosphorus availability, in contrast to more acidic conditions where phosphorus tends to be fixed with aluminum. So when we think about the carbon to nitrogen ratio specifically, I showed a table like this last in the last session that the last webinar that I presented. We can see that there is quite a range of C to N ratios, 12 to 5 for broiler litter. For laying hens, it's 3 to 10. Sheep 13 to 20, swine 9 to 19, cattle can range between 11 and 30 to 1. But what I want to highlight here is that the microbial C to N ratio. So these are the C to N ratio of the bacteria and the fungi tends to range roughly around 8 or 10 to 1. And so that's an important consideration when we're talking about that optimum C to N ratio of your amendment being in the range of 25 to 1. And so we can see that a majority of the manures, of the animal manures, because of their high percent of nitrogen, tend to have C to N ratios that are much closer to the microbial C to N ratio, which may result in very rapid mineralization or rapid release and decomposition of some of the elements of interest, particularly of nitrogen. And that may be a good thing, or it could become a detrimental thing if you're losing too much nitrogen to the environment too quickly. In contrast, we see on the plant side, straw, hay, silage, corn silage has a C to N ratio of 38 to 43 to 1. Straw in general may have a range between 48 and 150. So we're looking at materials that may start to be immobilizing nitrogen in particular, or other nutrients in the soil. Looking at other types of potential amendments, culled potatoes, fruit wastes, olive husks. Well, olive husks are not likely something in our region that we're going to be worrying about at this point. But soybean meal, any kind of vegetable produce. So quite a range of C to N. And so you can't, when we're talking about management of and considerations around the management of different types of soil amendments or potential soil amendments, we really need to start with kind of basic chemical characteristics such as the C to N ratio. That helps us understand, some of the potential impacts as we look at applying those to soils. So how does that work when we're talking about the C to N ratio, when we're talking about the considerations around decomposition and drivers for decomposition? As I was just mentioned earlier, when we're talking about factors that affect decomposition, we're really talking about interactions between the microbiology in the soil and actually even the microbiology that's inherent in the material itself. That's microbiology that has invaded, colonized the soil amendment even prior to the addition into soil, and chemistry. So the substrate quality, so that's the quality of the soil amendment itself, and the quantity that's being added, so that can be a rate of application, are important factors that will drive decomposition, what's going to be released and how quickly. Certainly considerations around the properties of the soil that you're adding to, texture, the pH in particular in our region, moisture, temperature, the structure of that soil. And overall, if we're talking about a cropping system of some sort or a managed land system, then how that land is managed will play a significant role in the interactions between all of these different factors. So just to highlight again, this is a cycle, a simplified cycle of, adding crop residues, decomposition of those residues by microorganisms and biota that goes into what we call humus, or a more stable organic matter, some potential for immobilization, release of proteins and sugars that help to enhance soil structure, mineralization. So this could be mineralization from the microbial biomass or from what they release into the soil, to the release of nutrients that then go into the crop or cycle back into microorganisms or other biota. So really, we're managing, as I mentioned initially here, we're managing that interaction between the biology, the physical matrices of the soil and the organic amendments, and we're managing the chemistry overall. So I presented a different version of this figure in the first presentation, but this is a nice figure because it illustrates, something that I think it's important to keep in mind every time you add some type of a soil amendment, an organic material into the soil. So when we're adding that, we're adding food in some sort of a structural form and some kind of a chemical form into the soil. And the microbiology is going to attack that food. The diversity of the microbiology is going to attack that food. In particular, it's attacking that carbon, and it's trying to take that carbon to create more biomass, more microbial biomass, which in turn is going to continue to feed on the organic matter that's been added. And what's critical here for all of us to understand when we talk about carbon sequestration in soil, it's not a one-to-one relationship. For every unit of carbon that you add into the soil, it doesn't mean that we are storing that carbon in its totality into the soil. What we need to understand is that we are trying to manage a natural process of enhancing the microbial biomass through their feeding, but through their feeding, particularly in a well aerated system, which we hope our soils to be, it means that they are respiring, or they are metabolizing the carbon, but in that metabolism, they are releasing carbon dioxide. So it means that carbon is being lost from the soil when we add amendments. But in the long term, so just as a back of the envelope calculation, you can make an assumption of close to 2/3 of the total organic carbon that's added could be respired by the microorganisms over time as they're consuming the organic matter that's being added. But what we're getting in our soils is this slow and steady increase of soil stable carbon. And that soil stable carbon may be in the form of more stable compounds, that carbon compounds in the soil that will be slowly decomposing over time and releasing those nutrients over time, or may be stored and continuously recycled by that microbial biomass over time. And this is a pretty critical piece to think about when we're thinking about the release of nutrients, because as the materials being decomposed in this kind of almost exponential decline, we're getting the flip of release of either carbon dioxide or potentially other elements of interest. And as a contrast to that, I again presented this diagram in the first webinar, but when we add a fresh material versus a composted material, so material that's already undergone some form of decomposition in a managed system prior to being added to soil, we can see that the magnitude of the decomposition is reduced considerably, which also will impact the magnitude of the fertility benefits that are going to be added. But in particular, it's going to impact the timing of nutrient release. But it also means that there's a greater potential pool of carbon that's going to be stored as stable carbon from the compost amendment versus a fresh or raw soil amendment. And we can see there's the magnitude there in difference. Other considerations that this is a very busy diagram, but I wanted to highlight that when we're talking about managing the chemistry and managing the biology, we're managing how the microbiology either releases these chemicals. So they may release the chemicals as they decompose or as they're decomposing some organic material. On the other hand, they may be taking ions or elements of interest out of, say, the soil pore water. Nitrogen, for instance, they may be taking that up in order to access carbon that's coming from the soil amendment. On the other hand, physical organo-mineral complexes. So this is the organic material itself that we're adding to the soil, or the soil mineral complexes that are already there. They're acting as surfaces, reactive surfaces, where all of these elements or these chemicals and ions that are being released into the soil solution are being held on. And so we're adding physical structures that provide surface for biology, microbiology, and chemicals to help hold on to, which will then result in release over time. And so we're managing very complex systems here when we're talking about managing amendments, but we still have tools that allow us to understand, at least on a very general and basic level, how these amendments might react when we add them to soil, and will inform our 4Rs, for instance, in terms of the source of the material, or the timing, or the rate, and the location that we want to put that material in. So again, another way to illustrate mineralization, in this case, specific to nitrogen. In mineralization, the concept of mineralization, nitrogen is being released for plant uptake. You can see that in the context of the C/N ratio. As the C/N ratio increases, the amount or the rate of mineralization is decreasing, and the potential for immobilization is increasing. And you can see that we're in that 25-to-1, where we're at a kind of an equilibrium state. And there's some examples on the right-hand side of materials that represent that low or high C/N ratio. So blood, fish, soybean meal is at a 5-to-1. Straw and corn stalks are on the greater than 50-to-1. Another way to picture that is that the mineralization process is the release of a nutrient. This particular case, nitrogen. Nitrogen is a big focus of mineralization in a lot of amendment science, versus the immobilization process, where your material may not be decomposing very quickly at all, or you may have an intermediate material, a material that immobilizes over some short period of time, but then once it reaches a sort of an equilibrium state, then we start to see mineralization. And again, this is how we can start to manage, or think about managing, or planning management of fertility release over the course of a growing season in the context of the use of amendments. So the C/N ratio may provide us a guide in terms of, do we want rapid mineralization, so we get rapid amount, there are larger amounts and higher amounts and more quickly, say nitrogen, by putting in materials that mineralize more quickly, or do we want something intermediate where we're going to see that release of those elements of interest later on in the season, where you may not be able to access the crop in order to fertilize, and it may need it. So N becomes available, N becomes unavailable. I wanted to illustrate that through again, there's a lot of research related to nitrogen, but through three different crops, or 4 different crops: corn, rice, soybean, and wheat. And just to highlight that, in this one, at least in this one particular study, what they found is that 77 to 81% of the nitrogen accumulated by rice, corn, and soybean occurred between the first 25 to 34 and 85 to 94 days. That means during the vegetative growth stage. And less than 3% of the N accumulated between the 0 to 34 days, or in the seedling stage. So we're typically adding fertilizer in that early stage because it's easy to get into the field, but that's not when these particular crops are really in their highest or higher uptake mode for nitrogen in particular. And then 17 to 20% of nitrogen is accumulated during the reproductive growth stage. We can see that wheat reacts on the figure on the left-hand side. Wheat reacts differently than soybean and corn and rice, but the overall trends tend to be very similar. So wheat, which is an overwintering crop, accumulated 6% of N at seedling stage. 72% at vegetative growth stage, and 22% at the reproductive growth stage. So values that are very similar to the rice, corn, and soybeans. And so that crops really, that 70 and 80% of nitrogen absorbed by crops is really at that vegetative growth stage. And so the timing component and the rate component of adding, whether it's fertility or fertility through soil amendments, can play a significant role in how we decide to manage soil amendments, whether it's the type of soil amendments or the rate or the timing of when it's applied. Again, a table that just tries to underscore some of the different characteristics of the, in this case, we're focused on manure because manure tends to be the closest with respect to the ability to mineralize and release, NP and K in a similar way to our synthetic fertilizers such as anhydrous ammonia and urea. You can see that liquid pig slurries, dairy slurries, chicken manure, the typical analysis tends to be much lower than you would find for your fertilizer, but the value of adding these materials may be in how it distributes these particular nutrients over the course of a growing season. In this particular busy, and I apologize, I didn't mean it to be this busy, but this busy table and figure, I wanted to identify, we have plant-based composts, manure-based composts versus pelletized or granular fertilizers, and then some liquid products, and then the mineralization or the amount of nitrogen and when it becomes available are illustrated on the figure on the right hand side. So in the first table, I just want to in the first instance, I want to highlight the lower C to N ratio, but somewhere around 13 of the YOLO batch 5 and the Solano compost. And so these are yard trimmings compost that are mixed with different materials, different sizes, and that's relative to the slightly higher C to N ratios of the batches 1 through 4. And you can see in the figure at the very, very top, 1, 2, 3, 4 have very different dynamics, but most of their dynamics are illustrating some form of immobilization, whereas the lower C to N ratio trimmings, the batch 5 and Solano, are highlighting more of a mineralization of nitrogen. But again, you look at the scale of percent of nitrogen, and it's quite low. We're talking somewhere around 0 to 5% or so. But as we start to look at the manure-based fertilizers, these are yard trimmings and poultry manure compost blends, vermicompost with cattle manure, other poultry manures. We can see that the manures are starting to, they're for the most part mineralizing nitrogen up to about 30% of the total nitrogen contained in these materials. As opposed to what we'd be more familiar with from our granular and pelletized fertilizers, even if they're poultry-based fertilizers, poultry manure, we can see that we're releasing a very large amount of the nitrogen that's contained within these materials. So again, you're looking at the nature of the amendment in the context of the timing and the quantity of the particular element, chemical of interest. Again, a lot of work being done on nitrogen, but similarly, we could be looking at or considering a potassium supply or phosphorus supply, or maybe even micronutrients. And the liquids, again, are more likely to be releasing more of the total N. And again, if you look at the bottom of the table in the C to N ratio, that's a C to N ratio of 5. That's very, very close to the bacterial C to N ratio. So when we're thinking about that mineralization, there's a lot of literature out there that helps us to understand the availability of these nutrients and when, and it's not 100% release. In this table, number one, we can see that total N available in the first year for different types of manures will vary anywhere between as low as 20% for composted manure. Remembering composted means that it's already been slightly decomposed or it's been more fully decomposed, all the way up to maybe a raw material like the swine manure where 90% of the nitrogen becomes available in the first year. But there's also a carryover supply that occurs in year two. Likewise, we have, again, just to not be solely focused on nitrogen, but we have, similar potential for other elements of interest or nutrients of interest like phosphorus being available over the period of time that it's applied in year one. We can see that phosphorus availability in an annual N-based manure, so that's if we're basing our rate based on nitrogen for the manure application, or versus if we're basing our annual application of the manure on a phosphorus basis. Very big difference, almost double the amount of phosphorus available, probably beyond the crop's ability to take up if we're basing our manure application, our rate, in this case, based on N versus on phosphorus. However, if it's based on a compost, you see the reverse trend where the phosphorus becomes more available if it were applying on a phosphorus basis versus a nitrogen basis. So how we decide on the rate of application also becomes quite important. I'm going to go a little bit more quickly as I see that I'm possibly going to run a little bit over time. But our, again, materials, and when we're talking about the mineralization, the microbial interactions, the immobilizations, I focused a lot on nitrogen, but not to suggest that nitrogen is the only element or the ions that we're most interested in, and it only occurs with nitrogen. It occurs with mineralization and mobilization will occur with any of the elements of interest, NPK and our micronutrients as well. They all undergo very similar chemical biological interactions. And therefore, it means that we have to be careful with respect to some of the outcomes such as runoff and erosion and leaching, which may have environmental impacts. I illustrated these types of tables or these figures in the introduction to soil amendments, but I wanted to come back to them again to just illustrate. Here's data that, so the figures around decomposition of carbon that I showed in some of the earlier slides, they're not just hand-drawn based on our imagination. They're based on data that's been generated over and over again in studies. Here's a biomass, a field incubation of poultry litter that's been buried in litter bags over the course of a year. We can see here's the remaining biomass. That's the lost carbon that's occurring over time. It's essentially the same relationship as I showed you earlier. Which means that as carbon's being decomposed, as the material, the organic matter is being decomposed, it means that the nitrogen is also being released. So the amount of nitrogen remaining in that material is going down, which means that it's going out into the surrounding environment. And we can look at that from a different perspective. We can look at that in the context of, the rates of application, whether it's a 5 ton per hectare or 10 ton per hectare, 15 ton per hectare, and what that means with respect to the kilograms per hectare of nitrogen released or phosphorus released or calcium released, my apologies, or potassium released. And we can see that not only the amount that is being released will change based on relatively small applications of this poultry litter manure, but also the timing around when those particular elements of interest are released. Some are plateauing or being released more quickly, such as in potassium and to some extent with calcium, and some are being released more fully over time, or plateauing a little bit more later on in that 1 year study. So some of the economics and returns, I just wanted to, in a very kind of simple way, illustrate, a perspective, a different perspective. I mean, we can be looking at the material just in the context of nutrient supply, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium supply to the crops, but we can also convert that into a value. I mean, fertilizer has a defined cost. It changes year over year, but certainly we can put a defined dollar value to fertilizer applications, and therefore we should be able to put in some type of a tangible value back into different types of soil amendments. I know I focused a lot on animal manures because they're easy, because they tend to be the most relatable to our synthetic fertilizers, but certainly the same application in terms of our thought process can occur with plant residues or compost or any other types of amendments that you may be interested in using. This is a table from the Ontario Ministry of Ontario Ministry of Food and Rural Affairs that they generate, that identifies the available nutrients from different types of animal manures, the total that may be available, and trying to then identify a yearly value, not only just in year one, but that carryover value in years 2, 3, and 4. I wanted to, identify, that these values are going to change as they relate to the change in the fertilizer cost per ton year over year in the general market. So the values that are being used here are just based on whatever the market costs are for these particular nutrients. So I've just taken some materials that I had analysis for. These are different compost or soil amendments. Some were kind of anaerobically digested materials. Just to highlight again, the loss and ignition is often a value that you get from some of the labs. It's not a carbon measurement directly. It's typically related to the organic matter content. And often we use an approximation of organic carbon of 54% carbon in organic matter, although in reality, the range can be quite high, somewhere between 45 and 54%. Again, a difference in when you're looking at these analyses of if they give you an as received versus a dry basis. The dry basis is the value that you're most interested in. That's your solids content, and that's really where your value with respect to the elements are. So I took the data from one of those composts, and I just took a 10 tons of compost per acre, which translates into 10,000 kilos wet. It had just under 70% dry matter, so that resulted into the solids content of just around 7,000 or 6,981 kilograms of dry material, with a percent nitrogen of 1.01%. We get 70.5 kilos of nitrogen supply per acre, and doing the same for phosphorus at 0.12% dry, and for potassium 0.977% dry. I calculate 8.4 kilos of phosphorus supply per acre and 68.2 kilograms of potassium supply per acre. Looking at Canadian fertilizer price trends and forecast for 2023 into 2024 for nitrogen and phosphate, I took sort of a value of $1.50 per kilo, and came up with, again, back of the envelope estimate of what 10 tons per acre might contribute in that year. Again, remembering that we're not getting 100% of that nitrogen becoming available in that first year, or the phosphorus or the potassium, although potassium may be slightly closer to 100%, maybe about 80%. But again, in a very simple calculation, we can kind of determine the overall value returns of about $200 per acre on a 10 tons of compost per acre. So it's not insignificant. I mean, the economics and returns can be quite significant. And I mean, again, we also have to take into context, again, sorry, it's a busier graph the way it appeared, but this was meant to illustrate that, when we're adding materials, the economic returns are one component of the whole equation. The other component is all of the different properties of the soils that are being also influenced by adding amendments, and whether those amendments are direct amendments as a compost addition, or whether they're amendments through cover cropping. Cover cropping has a whole host of benefits of adding organic matter and cycling organic matter back into soil, beyond the fact that it provides ground cover over periods of time when we might have large precipitation. So all of these different production systems in Nova Scotia have been measured for a range of different soil health properties, such as respiration, the C to N ratio, changes in total nitrogen, total carbon, the particulate organic matter. And we can see that there are differences in how these systems are managed, and therefore there is an influence with respect to not just the overall mechanical or intensity of management, but also the types of amendments that may be added, organic matter that may be added back into those systems. And so there are economic dollar value returns, as well as, again, maybe slightly less tangible, but certainly measurable outcomes with respect to the soil quality and soil health properties. Just to end this off, thinking about soil amendments and how we manage them, the method and timing of application of managing those materials to avoid soil compaction, to avoid soil erosion. So that's that timing. To avoid water pollution, that may be a function of timing and the rate and how you determine the rate of your amendments. But considering the whole system, as most producers do, you consider the environmental conditions. Is it raining? Is it dry? Understanding the texture of your soil and how your texture may be influencing the amendment that you're adding, or how the texture may be influenced by the organic matter or the amendment that you're adding, and that may be a change that you're moving towards, adding an amendment that's going to absorb and retain more water for periods when we may be encountering less precipitation. Obviously, previous management will play a role in those considerations as well. Uneven application rates, or even how you determine your application rates. Is it based on nitrogen, which tends to be very typical, but means that you may be also exceeding the soil's ability to assimilate other components, such as, say, phosphorus, because phosphorus is being over applied, or you may be applying materials, that, or other components that may be adding to the salt content, changing pH, changing the carbon nitrogen dynamics, which means that you're changing release time, or there may be contaminants that are associated with those amendments that you need to keep in mind. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge the OFCAF program and Perennia. I certainly like to acknowledge Dalhousie University, and thank you for your time. And I'm certainly prepared to stick around and answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Awesome, Gordon. We actually do have a question in the Q&A so far. So if anyone else has any more as we go through this one, feel free to add them to the Q&A or to the chat.
Okay, question, so
yeah,
I can see it. Yeah. So do we know precisely why a higher carbon ratio immobilizes nitrogen, and what is happening? Well, okay. So I'm going to identify. Do we know precisely? I'm going to say no, we don't know precisely, but we do know, based on a large amount of scientific inquiry, generally what's happening. So as I mentioned, why it was important to recognize the C to N ratio of the microbes, of the microbial biomass, somewhere between 8 to 10 to 1. Right. So let's say 10 to 1 for argument's sake. So if the microbial biomass has their bodies have a C to N ratio of 10 to 1, for instance, and when they are metabolizing, let's say roughly 2/3 of that carbon is going to be released as carbon dioxide. So then for every 3 units of carbon 2 units are going to be lost and 1 unit's going to be incorporated. So if you have so simplistically, if you have a C-to-N ratio of roughly 25, 30 to 1, which means there's roughly a 3 to 1, like there's a kind of a 3 to 1 ratio relative to the microbial biomass, then it means that you're getting a single unit of carbon that's being incorporated into the biomass, and then there's the 2 units of carbon that are being released, and then you have that single unit of nitrogen that is balancing out, again, it's balancing out what will be incorporated into the microbial biomass as amino acids and proteins. So that's the sort of the simplistic way to answer that. Certainly we see that relationship in different types of materials, but it's not absolute because as I talked about in the introduction to soil amendments, everything's contingent on the environmental conditions like soil texture, moisture, temperature, but also the physical characteristics of the amendment that we're adding. Is it a coarse material? If you think about a straw particle, a straw particle is a strand. It may have a waxy coating, and so the ability of the organisms to access the carbon is going to be inhibited by that waxy coating, which either needs to be degraded first or it needs to be broken up to, again, allow access into the more available pools of carbon. That's where, when I talk about the substrate quality and the quality of the carbon, there's a range of different carbon compounds, sugars, for instance, that are very easy to decompose versus cellulose or lignin that are more progressively harder to decompose. Hope that answers your question. Threw a lot of information at you all. I hope some of it was useful. Certainly my contact information is pretty easily available. You can either contact Perennia for it, but if you have any questions that arise beyond tonight, certainly feel free to reach out to me by email.
Yeah, exactly. And both your previous webinar from 2 weeks ago, the introduction, as well as tonight's webinar will be soon available on our Perennia's YouTube channel. So I think it's just at NS Perennia on YouTube. So we'll get both of those recordings up there soon. So
yeah, and again, these are, and I know I've sort of jumped into things here. They're intended to be a bit of a sequence. So the first webinar really tried to provide a broad context associated with what are soil amendments, what are some of the general characteristics that we want to keep in mind prior to management or thinking about management. And then this one was really, again, more focused around, why do we manage these materials? What do they give us? But also what do we need to consider in, that context of what they give us, both for good and for the potential, for, let's say over applying, something that, particularly when we're trying to manage these environments sustainably. The next webinar will focus on some of the conversion processes. So I'll talk a little bit about composting, anaerobic digestion, and other ways that we can try to convert or process, different materials, particularly in the context if you're generating a lot of materials, but also, how then after we process these materials, can we then manage them for, specific purpose, such as, the use as a source of fertility. But I'll go into a little bit more detail with respect to, other considerations that are more current, certainly climate change mitigation and storage of carbon.
Well, thank you so much, Gordon. I don't see any more questions, so people are still mulling everything over, all the information you provided. So thank you again. And
excellent. Thank
you. See you next
time. My
time.
pleasure. We'll see you all. Take care. Have a good evening.